Alrighty, gang. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's a little disconcerting that I can't see very many faces, but that's okay. You don't need to turn your screens on. I'll get used to it. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm very nice to meet all of you. Normally what I would love to do is do a round the table introduction, but there is currently 30 of you, almost 30 of you, and that would end up taking the whole session. And so I'm afraid I can't do that. But if you'd like to put a note in the chat as to where you're from and what brought you here, that would be great. I would love to. This is all being recorded. So if you need to step away or if you can't stay for the whole thing, don't worry. By the time we're all done, I will upload this to my YouTube channel and I will send it out to all the participants. So if you miss something or you want to go back on something, it will be available to you. And if you have any questions, I would actually recommend, I would say put it in the chat, but it's probably better if you actually just call out my name, and we'll stop and I will answer questions. Don't be afraid to do so because I love questions and I love discussion. So feel free to jump in if you need to at any point. Once I turn the screen on, it'll be hard to see you all. So just be sure to try to get my attention and we'll go from there. All right. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment here. Where's my entire screen? Share my whole screen. There it is. Okay. All righty. So I knew that was going to happen. Okay, wait a sec, guys. Sorry. When someone comes in, this is what happens. Yeah, I definitely won't be able to see the chat if anyone has questions. So just holler if you need me. Okay, let's try that again. So for those of you who've never met me before, there's some people here who do know me, but a lot of you are people I don't know. So hi, thank you so much. My name's Heather. My last name's Heinem. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and actually will only be living in Winnipeg for another month. I'm moving up to my cottage 2 hours north of Winnipeg up along Lake Winnipeg. So I will be out in the forest in the next little while. But as far as background's concerned, my background is actually, I'm a scientist by training. I have a PhD in conservation biology. I studied owls for many years. I knew that was going to happen. And I got my PhD studying conservation biology of owls. But after many, many years of being a student and being a scientist, the thing I loved the most was teaching people about the world and nature and what I found really interesting. So I was also an interpreter at the time. I've been an interpreter in some way, shape, or form for 30 years. Actually, this year is my 30th anniversary since I started guiding. And I managed to funnel all of that experience and knowledge and my love for teaching into the business that I have today, which is called Second Nature Creative Interpretation. I have been making interpretive signage in some way, shape, or form for how many years now? 14 years I've been in business. I have worked all over Manitoba. I've worked in Ontario, a bit of Alberta. And I have done everything from static signage to murals. I have worked on films. I have worked on ebooks. Anything that involves explaining things to people in engaging ways, chances are I've had a chance to do it. So hopefully I can take some of this experience and help you today with any projects that you're hoping to move forward. So let's start with the basics. Let's talk about what is interpretation. Interpretation is all about education. Freeman Tilden is known as the father of heritage interpretation. He was an interpreter with the National Park Service for many, many years. He was born in the late 1800s. And he kind of became the father of explaining what interpretation is and sort of setting the rules for how it works. And his definition is interpretation is an educational activity which aims to reveal meanings and relationships through the use of original objects. Well, hang on. I can't see what I'm doing. Sorry. I'm trying to read it and I can't see it. By firsthand experience and by illustrative media, rather than just simply communicate factual information. So Really, information is not interpretation. You often will hear information is not interpretation, but all interpretation involves information. You are conveying information, but it's more than that. You're looking to engage people. You want to engage them at multiple different levels. You want to engage them intellectually, spiritually, emotionally. You kind of want to hit them in the heart, basically. That's the whole point of interpretation. And to do that, you use different stories, you use ideas, you use your values. All of these things come together to create good interpretation. Now, I mentioned a minute ago, information is not interpretation. You'll see a lot of signage out there that are informational signage. I make informational signage, I make interpretive signage. There's nothing wrong with informational signage. It's just not quite the same thing. So this is one I did a few years ago about the Dufferin Gang, which was a bunch of people who lived on Dufferin Street in Selkirk, Manitoba, and they all joined World War II together all at the same time. So it tells a story, but it's very informational. It doesn't really provoke as much as a good interpretive sign would do, but it still serves a very useful purpose. People who are relatives or anyone who just wanted to learn about the families absolutely get a lot of information out of this sign. Interpretation, it provokes, it asks questions, it gets people thinking. This one here is one I did actually for Arborg Pat, talking about the First Nations who lived in that area around the time that settlers first arrived in the late 1800s. And in that situation, people were literally moved out of their homes. And so the intention was to provoke people into thinking, how would you feel if somebody showed up and decided, I'm living in your house now? So you really want to provoke curiosity. You want to provoke action, a desire to learn more. There we go. So interpretation can look like a lot of different things. Obviously, guided tours and experiences are very common. Taking people out on the landscape, walking them through your museum. Those are very common, but are also quite labor intensive. You need to have staff, or you have to have volunteers, people who can do that kind of work regularly. So a lot of people go with a static type of interpretation, things like signage, art. You can use murals as interpretation. You can use statues. Lots of different ways art can be used for interpretation. Or you can get really technical and high tech about it and start doing digital interpretation, either through self-guided tours. You can do audio tours. You can, the one that you're looking at in that photo is actually a touch screen that I worked on, something that people can interact with. The signage is what we're going to be talking about today, and it's pretty, well, in the grand scheme of things, it's a cost-effective communication tool. It's something that you can have on your site 24/7 in all seasons, assuming your site is open to all seasons. It's a great thing to use in places like the top photo there is a place called Pelly's Lake, Manitoba. It is really off the beaten path, and it's one of those things that when you find it, it's a really happy accident. And it allows those signs that are there now allow people to learn about this really amazing place that otherwise would never get any form of interpretation, because it's not a place that you can staff. It increases your visitor engagement. It tends to keep people in a place for longer. Signage also tends to make people feel like they belong there. I'm supposed to be here, and this is a place that I want to exist in. And especially for the people involved in the making of it, it can engender a sense of stewardship and a desire to protect. That is really the whole goal of good interpretation, is the desire to protect the resources that are being interpreted. From a more marketing standpoint, it tends to entice people to stay longer, to linger, to potentially explore a new pathway. If people know that there's signage out there, they might seek it out and try to explore a little bit further. It's a great way to define a region. So if you're dealing with an entire, say, like if you're a Manitoban in the group here, we have different regions in our province. One is called the Interlake region, for example. You can use that to define the whole region by potentially creating signage that's all branded to that region. So people know that they're in the Interlake because they have signs that say, Interlake on them. I've done signs for municipalities where we've branded them. They're different colors for different communities, but they are all the same look. And it allows people to know, oh, I'm in that municipality. Great way to define trails. Although I have to laugh, the two examples I put up here don't actually have a lot of signage on them. But there's still ways of creating a sort of a uniform story along a trail that you've created. So hopefully that gives you a sense of why you might want to use interpretive signage. But in order to do that, you need to understand what goes into making them. And so we talk a lot about the principles of interpretation when we work in this field. And I mentioned before, Mr. Tilden, Freeman Tilden, like I said, he worked for the National Park Service in the US for many, many years. He lived almost 100 years. And he was the very first person to kind of put the rules down on paper. And he actually outlined 6 different principles of interpretation in his book. And then since then, there have been a number of people who've expanded on them. Larry Beck and Ted Cable, both professors of heritage interpretation and marketing and tourism, came out with a book several years later, expanding on Tilden's principles and expanding it into 15 different main things that you should think about when you make signs. I've gone through all of them, and I've kind of boiled it down to 10 that I think are really important based on my experience doing this kind of work. And I'll walk you through them. So the first one to keep in mind, that interpretation is very much an art, and it relies on a number of different arts, not just the art of storytelling, but art itself. Like, so whether illustration or photography or acting, any of these different arts can be put together to create good interpretation. So you have to be a bit of an artist in some way, shape, or form to be a good interpreter. As I mentioned before, information is not interpretation. It's not just a case of laying out facts. You're not just saying, this person lived here at this time, and he died, and then that's information, and it's interesting. But interpretation is so much more than that. It's about drawing people into the story, about bringing people, sort of helping them set their foot into the world that you're trying to interpret to them. In order to do that, though, you really need good information. And so that's where making sure you have your facts straight is really, really important. You can't do good interpretation if you have bad information. That's really important to keep in mind. I mentioned before that interpretation, the main goal is not just education or instruction, it's provocation. You want to provoke people, whether you want to provoke some kind of emotional reaction, or if you want to provoke curiosity to learn more. You want to provoke people to explore your area in more detail. Oftentimes I will include calls to action that's, encourage people to go and actually look for something that we're specific that's on the site that we want them to learn about. We might want to provoke them to make change in the world. Perhaps we're talking about climate change or pollinators or anything that we ourselves can have an impact on. It's really important that your interpretation provokes that desire to affect change. And so that's really a main goal of interpretation. So to do that, you want to build along a theme. So we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail as we move forward today. But thematic interpretation is really important. You need a story, because I mentioned before, it's based on storytelling. So if you don't have a good story, and if you don't have a really coherent plot, you're going to lose people, and they're not going to want to learn more. So that's really important. It's also important to not try to tell stories that aren't yours. I know that sounds kind of weird, but for example, I'm a white girl in Winnipeg. I have worked with First Nations a number of times to help tell their stories, but it's not my story to tell. So it's really important that the voice that's telling that story is not mine. And so you can, as an interpretive specialist, though, I can work with cultures that are not my own and help them, but ultimately the voice is not mine in that storytelling. And so that's what I mean by don't try to tell stories that aren't yours. You can help share those stories and potentially be an ally, but you ultimately have to keep in mind your own biases and where you come from and how you can help tell that story, but maybe not be the narrator, for example. Does that make sense to everybody? I can see one nodding head. I can't see a lot of heads, but that's okay. You want to make it relatable. People aren't going to care if they can't relate it to their lives. So if you're talking, even history is, I know a lot of times people are like, well, how am I going to get history, relatable to people? But there's so many different ways that you can put people in the shoes of whatever story it is you're trying to tell. And that's a challenge sometimes. So it's something to think about when you're creating your stories or figuring out what you're going to put on your panels. Ask yourself, who's coming to visit and how am I going to reach them? What matters to these people? And then think of ways to touch them in that way. And that's a really important thing. Otherwise, you're just going to lose your audience. It applies to whether you're giving a talk or whether you're making signage. It's important that you understand your audience. Quality and quantity matters. You can overdo it. You can have way too many signs. Sometimes it's better to have one or two that just really hits the nail on the head, so the main thematic points, than have like 6 or 7 that's scattered around a place. And most of us are dealing with space, so it's really important to be choosy about how you tell your story and how many panels it's going to take you to do that. Oops. So doesn't matter how fancy the technology is, if you haven't planned it well, it's not going to matter. It needs to have, like I said, good themes, good outlines, solid information. You need to have this all figured out before you start making something really fancy, because otherwise you're just wasting a bunch of money to create something that ultimately ends up being gobbledygook, and that's not helpful for anybody. So don't be afraid of technology, and if you've got the budget for it, go to town. But make sure that you have a good solid plan and a good solid framework before you try to take that leap. When we worked on that touchscreen that I showed you earlier, that was part of a larger ebook that I worked on that took a year of planning to get it to a point where it made sense. And so be aware that these are fairly long projects sometimes. As I mentioned, interpretation should really instill a sense of wonder. You want people to go, wow, I had no idea, or wow, that's so cool. And, or, I mean, maybe it's something particularly emotionally difficult, then you kind of create a solemnity in people. But all of it is hopefully to engender an appreciation for whatever it is you are interpreting. You want people to care. And that's really important. And that kind of leads into my last one, is to make people care, you have to care. You need to have passion for your subject. You need to have passion for the people who are coming to visit your site. It's without that passion, you just won't have a connection. And so that's really important. I don't think passion's an issue in this group. I'm sure all of you guys are very passionate about what you do and where you work and the places that you're sharing. So that's a great first step, and take that and run with it. It's super important. Any questions? I can't see all of you, so just be sure to say holler if there is one. All right. So let's talk about how we get from idea to signs. And you probably guessed where I was going when I started this, is you really want to make a plan. You need a good, solid plan in order to make things work. A lot of these types of projects take multiple years to complete. It's rare that I've worked on larger projects that haven't taken 2 or 3 years as funding cycles permit. And so during that time frame, people in the organization might end up leaving. You might have different people stepping in. It's really important that you have a plan, because it keeps the continuity of the project. It also just makes sure that everything is coherent. So I'm going to stress on this one quite a bit, because it's never fails. Because it's just, without a good plan, it doesn't have to be complicated, but it needs to be written down in order for you guys to make sure that you come up with something that makes sense in the end. So let's talk about it. What's a good plan? Well, a good plan assesses the resources that you have. So whether it's nature, whether it's history, whether it's science, something, you're at a science center, figure out, what do we got? Do we have artifacts? Do we have trails? Do we have books? Do we have artwork. What are we working with here? And what are we trying to tell? What type of story are we trying to tell with those objects or landscapes out there? And we really want to talk to our stakeholders. So that's, we'll talk about that in more detail, but the people who are involved in your organization, anybody who could potentially give you some help in creating the story. Those are all the people that play very important roles in the development of your project. A good plan outlines the theme. I always refer to the theme as the plot, because we're telling a story. What's the plot of the story? Where are we trying to go? What are we trying to tell them? So a good plan is going to answer all of those questions. It's going to provide a blueprint for implementation. It's going to talk about what is this thing going to look like? How are we going to put it in the ground, or are we going to put it on a wall? What are we doing with it? That's really an important part of the plan. And if it's a large project, it prioritizes efforts. So the example I have over here in this picture is actually one I worked on in Reston, Manitoba. We had 4 different sites that we were working on. This was one of them, called the Peanut Trail. And of those 4 different sites, we basically ordered them from, we're doing this one now, and they're all the way to the one that's going to wait until funding becomes available. So it's important to kind of itemize and order what you're going to do, so that, again, if your staffing changes, you'll be able to keep things going. The other good reason to have a plan is you can now go to your funders and say, look, we have a plan. This is a much easier way to secure funding than it is to just kind of willy-nilly go in there. So any good funding organization requires some kind of grant proposal. The plan becomes a large chunk of your grant proposal. So who do we involve in the plan? So this is our stakeholders. So your staff, if you have staff, volunteers, if you have volunteers, any local stakeholders. So for example, I'm working with the town of Winnipeg Beach right now. So we've involved both the town, and there happens to be a provincial park that encompasses part of the town. And they haven't always worked super well together, but we managed to get both of them at the table recently in order to make sure everybody was on the same page. I find a lot of signage projects are a great way of bringing sometimes disparate groups together who really should be working together and aren't, to get them talking to each other again. You want to bring in information experts if you have any local historians, any local naturalists, any local knowledge keeper. I've worked with First Nations. It's very important if you're working with First Nations that you involve elders and other knowledge keepers, and afford them the necessary respect in order to work with them. I recommend having an interpretive planner, so me, or somebody like me who kind of understands how this all works, to come in and help you navigate all of this. It's not completely, you can do this. You can DIY this if you want to, but it goes a lot smoother if you've got someone who really knows what they're doing, who can carry the ball all the way through to the end. If you also want to talk to either an exhibit designer or a landscape architect. So for example, my job, I make signs. And so I will do everything up to getting the panel finished for you, but I am not in a position where I can figure out the best way to get it on the landscape or build it onto the wall. I mean, if it's simply a case of attaching it to a wall, that's different. But oftentimes, if you're working in a museum, you have a whole exhibit that you're building around it. So you need somebody with that kind of experience to help you figure out how to make it all work together, how to make the artifacts work with the signs, and how to make everything become cohesive. And so usually I will work with one or the other, depending on how big the project is, to make sure that the project works cohesively. Any questions about that? No? Okay. Hopefully I haven't lulled you all into a stupor. So one of the things that a plan should address is, who is your audience? This is a page out of a plan I did for the Brandon Riverbank in Brandon, Manitoba. We were lucky to have access to a lot of demographic data because it's a city. And so they had quite a bit more information than a lot of places do. So don't panic if you look at this and go, oh my God, we don't know this. But most places at least have a sense of who their visitors are. Maybe you have a visitor book. Maybe you keep track of where people are coming from when they sign up or when they come in and pay an admission. That kind of data is really important because it'll help you understand, am I dealing with adults? Am I dealing with children? Am I getting predominantly school groups? Who are the people who use this area the most? Because how you talk to them changes depending on who you're working with. I'm working on a project right now that is mainly geared to school groups. So we're talking about curricula. We're talking about how do we deal with the needs of the teachers who are coming to that area. So it varies quite a lot. So it's really important to know who your audience is before you start writing for them. Then the next big question is, what's your story? You need some kind of thematic framework. You need some sort of plot. Now, this one looks crazy complicated, and I get why. It was crazy complicated. This particular project I've been working on for 3 years. It's with an Indigenous-based education organization here in Winnipeg. We are working with a couple of elders. We're working with several knowledge keepers, and we had a lot of very complicated stories that we had to make sense out of. But all we knew at the end was it all boiled down to the earth. So if you look at the very bottom of that framework, you'll see the word Akiwejanini or Akiwenaji. That means earth. And so all of this kind of came out in a circle from that. And so that's what you're looking at in here. It makes sense to my clients, but it's important to I often will create a thematic framework that is visual because I think it helps people understand what's going on with their story and how we're going to make it work on a landscape or in a museum. It doesn't have to be this fancy. It can, oops, hang on. That's the way it looked in that particular situation. It can be just a simple flow chart. You also want to address the questions, why are you doing this? What are our goals? What are we trying to achieve with this signage? And when we talk about interpretive goals, we tend to look at 3 different kinds of goals. We talk about cognitive goals, which is basically what do we want people to learn? What are the takeaways that we want people to have from our site? Do we want to have them learn about fish? Do we want to have them learn about history? Do we want to learn about pollinators? What are we trying to teach these people? Then you want to think about what are your effective goals? What do we want people to feel? Do we want them to feel happy? Do we want them to feel concerned? Do we want them to feel like they really want to preserve something? Those are things that you want to think about. And then our last goals are our behavioral goals. We want to think about what do we want people to do with this information. So I can tell you right now, I've done probably 6 or 7 pollinator panels in my lifetime. And, and I love doing them. But I mean, our main behavioral goal is to help people preserve pollinators. So how do we do that? Through the information that we convey to them. Same with climate change, same with history. What are we trying to encourage people to go learn more about a subject? To lay all that out is really helpful in terms of helping you direct what you're going to talk about and how your signs are going to be laid out. So these are really important things to have in your plan. Then the next question you're going to answer is, how are we going to do this? Are we doing it as regular panels? Are we just doing rectangles on posts? Are we doing little plaques? Are we doing signs on a wall? There's lots of different ways that we can do these things. And so the plan is basically there to help you figure out, what is it going to look like? Are they going to be big signs? Are they going to be little? Are they going to be round? Are they going to be square? Are they going to be purple? Those are all the sort of the technical stuff involved. I've never done purple signs. That would be fun. You want to sort all that out going forward, because again, if this is a multi-year project or even just a multi-month project, you might forget down the line what it was going to look like once you get to that stage. So this is important to do as well. So what do you get when you've done all this work? You get a plan that outlines the broad thematic strokes. So it creates your framework, it creates the plot. It includes usually content outlines for your panels. So what is each one going to talk about? It'll include design themes and templates. So we're going to do a panel that looks like this. It's going to prioritize which ones to start with, because like I said, I've worked on several projects that have taken multiple years. So we know which ones to start with because they're the most important ones to get done first. It'll often include a small budget. It's usually not an exhaustive budget, but it's often just a basic Here's the things you need to know going forward, because that's really helpful when you're creating grant proposals to move forward with the implementation of the signs. So yeah, there's a lot of different pieces to these. Some, I mean, plans can range in size from maybe 5 pages to, I had a good one was almost 50 pages because we were planning an entire city. So it was a big job. So it's never a quick little 1-page thing, but it doesn't have to be huge, but it should be written down, like I said before. Any questions about planning? Comments, concerns? No? Everybody still with me? Okay. All right, so let's talk about designing interpretive panels. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do it and how it might be different than some other people do it. I have a kind of a unique perspective, partly because I can do the whole thing at once. I don't always do the whole thing at once. I work with graphic designers. I work with landscape architects who do design work for me. But I can do my own layouts, I can do my own illustrations, and I can do my own writing. And so sometimes I can do an entire panel from start to finish, which creates, I think, a very holistic approach. And so I take that holistic approach and I apply it to a team as well. So it doesn't matter whether it's 1 person or 3 people or 5 people. I think it's really important to just kind of start with this approach because I think it works out a little bit better in the end. So I'm going to walk through one that I did from start to finish. And kind of give you a sense of how it worked. So this is after the plan. So in this particular case, the panel was all about pollinators. As I said, I've done a lot of these. But we were talking about pollinators in a woodland setting in a garden. We'd outlined what we want to talk about. We want to talk about the different kinds of pollinators. They wanted to talk about the different hosts. They wanted to talk about why we need them and how do we help them going forward. And so I kind of just came out with a very basic framework of this. But the main thrust of this one was going to be a illustration that illustrated both the different types of pollinators and the plants that they relied on. They really wanted this thing illustrated. I'm like, okay. So even with this just vague, when I do a content outline, I do a visual content outline like this because I want to make sure that it's all going to fit on one panel. And in fact, this probably could have fit on 2 panels. This is a bit overkill, but we made it work. Oh, never. Sorry, guys. Got some real latecomers. All right, so then because they wanted a diagram or an illustration of the different flowers and pollinators, this is where we went next, was a sketch. And I know this makes it look like I don't know how to draw, but this was just a basic thumbnail of trying to plan out how we're going to do this. So when I do a panel, I like to look at the visual aspect and the written aspect all at the same time. So we have the written outline of what do we want to talk about, but then I had to come up with the what is it going to look like setup. And for me, I find that more effective to do it all together. If I'm working with a team, this is the point where we sit down and kind of block things out together. And that way we can write into the space. And that way you don't end up with more text than you have room for. So from here, we took the sketch, did a whole whack of illustrations. It was a lot of work. And then as the illustrations started coming together, we started building, I started building the panel up. So going back to those those outline headings. So we talked about the threats to survival. We talk about the relationships. How am I going to make this all fit? And so at this point, we started to kind of work it all out, block it on the actual panel, and move things around as we needed to. In the end, final illustration was ready to go. And then I write the copy last. So I've known all along what I'm going to write about. That's never been a question. The outline's always been there. But the text itself got written after I finished the illustration and after I finished the layouts, because that way I know I have this much space to tell this particular part of the story and I can't go over. And so that way you don't end up with extra text. I've done it in reverse. I've worked with companies where I've been forced to write the text first and then do the illustrations and then do the layout. Almost inevitably, we end up with more text than we have space for. And that has to then go back and be cut. So it is, I find, a more holistic approach if you can come at it from the design aspect almost first. I mean, you still have the outline, so the content creation is there. It's kind of happening all at the same time. So even if you're working with a team of 5 people, I find it much more helpful if you can do it this way. You can't always, but it's for me, it's the more effective way to do it. It's very rare that I get to do one that's this fancy. This is a very the group I work for this one had a very large budget, because illustrations take forever, and so they get quite fancy. But it was very fun to work on. So, what makes a good panel? There's a lot of things to think about when you start making panels. Where do we start? Well, it's good. As you can tell, I'm an illustrator, so I'm going to definitely suggest you don't do the plaque on a post look. I don't find a lot of people tend to be attracted to a big, large block of text. For me, it just doesn't get your attention. So color helps a lot. It doesn't have to be colorful though. You can go with a very monotone, dark gray color if you want and still make it look amazing. You just need to bring in some imagery. You need to bring in some aspects that are going to catch people's attention, because we're visual people and it's only getting worse, as social media shortens our attention spans and makes it harder for us to stay in one place for very long. Something visually attractive is really important. You need to catch people's attention. A really fun example was a project. This is the peanut line again, the peanut I talked about. The peanut line, for those of you who are curious, was actually the name of a railway that ran from a little town called Reston, Manitoba to another little town called Wolseley, Saskatchewan. And it was called the peanut line because the whistle on it sounded like a peanut cart. That's where the name comes from. So we were engaged to do a bunch of these signs for the peanut line. This was the initial design that my graphic designer came up with when we started working on the panels. And I'm like, I like the color, I like the gray, but it felt really, I don't know, it just didn't catch my eye. And I was like, we need to catch people's eye. So we did a little bit of rejigging, and this is where we ultimately ended up. So I think comparing the two together, which one do you get more attracted to? What do you guys think? I'm really like, this one catches my eye, and we've made the illustrations a lot better, the images a lot bigger. We blew them all up and drew people in with color and visuals. So that's ultimately, I was very happy with how these turned out in the end. But I think we started a little bit boring to start with. So it's good to have a visual theme. These were done for Lundar, Manitoba. Having some kind of theme, visual look that goes all the way through. Doesn't have to be the same color, but I try to come up with something that's a template that we can then build from. So it's nice to have something that makes things feel consistent. And you want to keep it simple. I pulled this photo off the internet. I really wish I knew where it was, but it's a very big mishmash of stuff. Like, I don't even know where I would start looking at that wall. So even if you're dealing with a lot of complex stuff all at once, try to create some sort of visual flow. So in this case, where you have a vertical flow, because we're talking about going up a tree, you want to create something that's going to draw the eye in one direction, or at least in maybe two directions at most. Just don't have people going 5 or 6 different directions all at once, because it just gets confusing and you lose your audience very quickly. You want to spell out community benefits. I like to title a lot of things in ways that ask questions. So like in this case, what good are wetlands? Why do we care? Because often that's what we're asking. Why should we care about this? I mean, I won't write a title quite like that, but you want to have something that gets people thinking about, why does this matter to me? Why should this be a thing? It's good to have accurate statistics and also relate them back to the visitor. So actually, this is from the same project talking about the Lake Winnipeg watershed. This was the audience for this were people from the Lake Winnipeg watershed. So we were helping them understand that you are one of 7 million people living in this area, and every single one of you has an impact on the watershed. And so we wanted to make that really, really clear. So putting it in people's shoes, I often will use, I will try to create, if I'm trying to explain something that's really hard to understand or hard to visualize, you talk about how many Olympic swimming pools worth of stuff, water something is. I try to find things like that to try to help people understand what's going on and visualize complex things in that way. And often I'll pick something that's local. So I was working on panels in Winkler, Manitoba, and I remember picking, I think, the schoolyard or something that people could really easily relate to help them understand what we were talking about. You want to have calls to action, and you want to make them very obvious and easy to understand. And you want to relate it back to the people that you're talking to. So I've done a lot of, other than pollinators, watersheds is another big one I do a lot of panels for. And who we talk to varies. I do a lot of signs that are in rural areas that are talking to rural people. And so it's important to give them calls to action that make sense to them. So you're not going to give them things that relate to an urban person if they're not living in an urban area. Same thing, vice versa. So you want to make sure that you give them stuff that they can do themselves, if that's what you want them to do. And it's really fun to provoke discussion. I know all of these questions that you're seeing on here I can't give you the visuals yet because I'm not finished the project, but we are working on a project right now this is the Indigenous Learning Center that I'm working with. This is the one it's geared to children, and it's geared to school children, and it's geared to teachers. And so each one of our panels includes a question, because we want to spur discussion. We want to get the kids talking to their teachers, and we want to get the teachers giving them projects that are based on the stuff that they're learning. And so full out questions are really great. You can take it a step further and bring in a full dialogic situation where you can give them an opportunity to share their information. So perhaps at the end of an exhibit, you put up a panel that asks some of these questions, and then give them an opportunity to write the answers. I've seen many museums do that over the years, where you kind of maybe give them a post-it note and they can add their answer to the wall. Ways of engaging people and getting them to interact with you is a really powerful way to get them thinking, because that's really what you want to do. And of course, you want them to be visually appealing. So, I mean, rectangle on post is a good tried and true way of doing things. But you can get really creative. I mean, I love this bottom one where they basically created the sign to match the peaks of the mountains. But they don't have to be rectangles. They can be all sorts of things. I particularly love the one on the staircase there, where you've got people thinking about how you can generate electricity from motion. Make it fun, so if you have the ability and you have the budget to do it, try to make it different. You get people's attention by being different. So what does it all cost, and how do we have to think, where do we even start? Well, it varies a lot, but there's 3 stages at which point you have to consider costs. So the planning stage, your stakeholders consultation, whatever research you're doing, and your theme development. So this is either done by someone like me, who's an interpretive planner, or it's done by somebody that's in-house at your organization, someone who knows how to do this kind of thing. So you can save costs, of course, by doing it in-house. But if you don't have that resource, then people like me there's a lot of interpretive planners all over the world that you can tap into who know how to do this kind of thing. Your average plan, at least here, I know not all of you are Canadian, so here I've seen them, it depends on how big it is. It can run anywhere from about maybe $5,000 to, we did a huge one for an entire city, and that was close to 50. So it really, that's huge. So keep that in mind. Most of you are probably not working at that level. So they're quite variable. But the thing to keep in mind is a good plan will save you money down the line. Because if you've got a good plan and you know where you're going, you won't be backtracking. And that happens a lot if you don't have a good plan. If you might get partway through and go, oh, we got to change their story, or something came up and we don't like this and we want to go back. I had one client several years ago who had to change, they got me to do panels and then went and changed their branding the next year. So we had to redo everything. If you get a good plan in place, you will save yourself money down the line. That I can assure you. Oops, there we go. The actual creation of the panels, so the design, content creation, so writing, illustrations, or image sourcing. This is a very niggly detail, but if you're going to source images, be sure you have permission to use them. You can use Creative Commons images for sure, but I'm struggling right now to get a hold of an image for a project I'm working on that I have permission to use. Because even if they're going on a sign in the middle of nowhere, there's still the thing of copyright. So you got to keep that in mind. Illustrations, as we talked about before, illustrations can bump up the cost dramatically because they take a lot more work. However, many companies, or at least I know I do, have a lot of stock images that they have created over the years that can be modified and brought in for a much lower fee than starting something from scratch. Graphic design is the layout of the whole thing. Some of that is done in the planning stages in terms of creating a template, but then you still have to get it all laid out onto the panel. So there's some costs associated with that. Average per panel price varies a lot. I would say right now my per panel prices are ranging somewhere between about $1,800, and that's really very much words and a couple photos. To that illustrated one you saw before was over 5,000 because it took a very long time to do. So it can range quite a bit. A few studies I've read have told people to budget about $20,000 for 4 panels. I'd say that's up a little on the high end, depending on what you're doing, or depending on who you've hired to do the job. But yeah, I would budget around 3 per panel just to be on the safe side. And so then the last thing you want to think about is installation. So the printing is depending on what you're having it printed on. If you're doing just basic dye bond, which is what you're seeing in these pictures here. So this is aluminum. It's an aluminum plywood sandwich with a vinyl overlay. That's where the image comes from. They're fairly inexpensive. You're looking at maybe $200-300 a panel for an average size. The big guys are going to be a bit more. But it can vary. You can get powdered aluminum. There's the triple laminate stuff, the stuff that you find in zoos and museums, that like the bigger guys, those are very expensive. For us Manitobans, they don't make those in Manitoba. We'd have to get them sourced out of province. And they can be in the thousands of dollars per panel. So that's something to keep in mind, but you don't have to go that big and crazy. Most of the stuff I work on is dye bond. If you come across something called Lexan at any point, it's Lexan. It's basically it's plexiglass with the vinyl underneath. So you're looking through the plexiglass at the vinyl. I'm not a huge fan. I find it gets cloudy over time, and it's not my favorite way of doing panels. So that's just a preference. You can have it done though, and it's about the same price as dye bond. So those are some options. You also have to think about how are we getting them, if we're doing this outside, how are we getting them in the ground? Is it just going to be a post in the ground? And if you do, you've got to remember that post has got to go several feet down into the ground. Are we putting a concrete footing in? Are we putting plexiglass over top of this? You can go super complicated or you can go super simple. Are we having to deal with landscaping? Is there any engineering involved? If you're dealing with concrete pads and stuff, sometimes you need to bring in engineers to do that kind of work. My colleague was working on one here in Winnipeg at the Forks, which is, for those who aren't Canadian, where at the center of our city, basically where the 2 rivers meet. It's a big tourist area, but it was also a meeting place for 10,000 years. And they started digging into the ground to put these posts in, and they had an archaeological site. They're like, oh, dang it. Now what? So that's things to keep in mind when you're doing these sorts of things. So yeah, there's quite a few costs to consider and steps to figure out, but this would break it down into a pretty good budget for you. And it's going to vary depending on who you work with and where you live and how things work. But that's pretty much all the details I've got. So we have still some time here. Does anybody have questions? I'm happy to answer questions till the cows come home.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, Pam. Pat.
With all the folks you've worked with, are there grants available like in Canada and Manitoba?
Yeah, there are grants available. I can only speak to Manitoba, and I know you're local, so that's fine. But Manitoba Heritage grants, of course, there's some. There is, oh darn it, Habitat. Darn, there's a bunch of them. I have a list, Pat, and I will find them, guys.
Thank you.
So for anyone who's local, I will dig up that list. Anyone who's not local, I don't have a lot of answers to that, unfortunately, in that I know it varies from province to province and state to state, but I know from my own experience with US interpreters that you guys have a little bit more to work with than Canadians tend to do. If there's anybody here who is American who wants to chime in on that, feel free, if they know anything they want to share with their fellow people. Okay, Kelly. Yeah, Glenn had a question. Glenn,
Um,
hang on, you said I'll get
the
to you in a
course,
second.
the Rotary clubs are willing to fund some panel construction.
That's good to know.
A question for you: do you critique panels?
I have never done it, but I'd be willing to offer suggestions. Yeah,
Okay.
that's
So,
something I've never done that before, but it is. I'm
okay.
happy to chat.
What would you charge?
I have no idea, Glenn. I'd have to send me an email with more detail and we'll figure it out. Okay.
Okay. And the other question, in your text, I notice sometimes you mix fonts types.
Yep.
Is that recommended?
It depends on what you're doing. I tend to use different fonts for titles than I do for the main body text.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's common and totally understandable. Oh, thanks, Tim. Tim's offered some information there in the chat about recreational trails for Trails Manitoba. Glenn, going back to your question, yeah, I will use different fonts for emphasis. You got to be really careful though. They need to go together. You can't suddenly go like crazy off in one direction and then
Yeah.
avoid like common. Don't
Basically,
use
sans serif and serif.
The most important thing is that it's legible.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
tend not to use serif fonts in the body text. I find it hard to read.
I noticed.
So yeah, I tend to use sans serif fonts in the body text because it's just a little clearer and easier to read. But depending on the look you want to provide, it can change quite a lot.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, legibility. And someone else asked me, Catherine asked me, how's too small for an interpretive sign? It varies, Catherine, on where the sign is and how close you can get to it, but I wouldn't go lower than probably 18 points for body text. If it's a decent sign, you can maybe go down to 12 for a caption and in maps, but be careful how small you go. There are, depending on where you are, there are accessibility standards, at least here in Manitoba, based on how far away you're standing from a panel. And you might be surprised at how big it needs to be in order to be read. Does that hopefully help? Izetta had a question as well, I think.
I did, yes. That vinyl overlay over an aluminum, you referred to, did you call it Diabond?
Yeah, it's called Diabond. It's D-I.
What was the term that you were using for that type of a sign?
That is, yeah, the term for that type of material is called Diabond. It's spelled D-I-B-O-N-D. I'll put it in the chat. And it is basically aluminum plywood sandwich. Most sign makers, that's almost always their go-to for this type of panel. So they'll probably know what you're talking about. It works pretty well. It can be scratched. If someone were to go at it with a key or something, they can scratch the vinyl off. I've only ever had that happen once. And it's just, there's always risks to putting a panel out. Someone's going to try to wreck it. Someone asked about other materials. Powder coated aluminum is one that I really like. Harder to find, but also there. Indoor panels, I can't remember off the top of my head. I would just recommend talking to any sign printer and tell them what you're trying to do with it, and they will help you come out with something that's relatively manageable. I've done we've done murals right on the wall too, using basically like a wallpaper type situation. So it can be done. Sorry, Hal, I don't have as many answers to that as I would like.
I think
Thanks,
it's important, very important to preserve your files so that you can replace a poster.
That is very true, Glenn. Yes, hold on to, when I hand over when I don't hand over the native files, I will hand over the proofs of the panels and then everything else I keep. But you need to hold on to those proofs, because if something goes wrong and you need to print them again, usually my contract says I'm not obligated to hold on to those proofs forever. I do, just because I'm me. But oh, that's okay. Nikki just asked where would we find, I will be putting it on YouTube and I will send the link to everybody, so don't panic. But going back to the keeping of your proofs, it's really important that you hold on to them, because technically whoever you hire to do this job is not required to hold on to them for the rest of their career. But the making of the proofs is the more expensive part. The printing of them is way less expensive. So hold on to those proofs when you're done. Thanks, Glenn. That's a good point. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Did people find this useful? Was this something that you guys appreciated?
Yes, I found it very useful.
Oh, good. Excellent.
I am in the midst of replacing a big sign in Sandy Lake, Manitoba.
Oh, yeah.
And it's got the trail on one side and a Sandy Lake map on the other side. And yeah, I'm all new at all of it. So
Oh, dear.
it was
You can do it,
and-
Andrea. I have faith.
and everybody that worked on it before has passed away. So all the
dear.
information and pictures are like,
Okay.
well,
I have faith, because you can do it. And if you have trouble, give me a call.
yes, I'm definitely going to hit you up on that. So
No problem.
thank you.
Yeah. Good. Well,
I have a
if-
question.
yes, Robert. Robert has a question.
What size of a Dibond panel would you suggest you use to post versus one post?
Okay, so a one poster, I would say you can go with about 18 to 24, maybe a little bit bigger, up to maybe 32. That's inches. If you go anything bigger than that, I would start looking at 2-ish. It depends on how the posts work. Like if you're doing just wooden posts, then I would definitely go up to 2 once you get bigger than that. Like I've done some that are 2 by 3 feet, and those tend to be a double post. But if you're using a metal post and you're using a different type of holder, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. That'll be supportive with one. But it's quite variable. A lot of times I really recommend talking to your sign maker and talking to whoever it is that you're working with the installation. So like I said, I work with landscape architects to help me answer those particular questions, because it's not my area of expertise. So I definitely will pull in experts to help me with that kind of stuff, because we don't want anything going flying.
No, okay, thank you.
No problem. Also, round your corners. If it's something that's going out in the outside that people can easily run into, talk to your printers about rounding the corners so nobody gashes their
okay.
leg open. Because that's not fun.
Okay, good.
So- Any other questions? I can't see everybody. Wow, there's a lot of you here. Where did you all come from? Okay, well, I think we got everything. So if there's no more questions, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. I hope again that you found this helpful. For those who did come in late and missed parts of it, this all was recorded. And so I'm going to, it is being recorded somewhere. And yeah, there's the recording thing. I will upload this to my YouTube channel, and I will send you all the link. So you can, and if anyone has any questions, do not hesitate to drop me a line. I'm happy to chat. And yeah, hopefully you can all have fun sharing your stories with the world. All righty. Well, you have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you, Heather.
You're most welcome. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Mhm. There